Okay, why don't we get started? I'm sure that people will continue to wander in. I'm guessing my volume is okay. Clarity is okay. Too loud? Too loud. Let's see if we can fix that. How's that? No. Whoops. Too quiet now? That's okay? Okay. So, welcome to this talk on how to win proportional representation. I'm your host. Sharon said, "Oh, somebody else should announce, should present for me and introduce me." But I guess I'll just introduce myself because I told Sharon no. So I'm Paul. I'm your host today. Why don't we just dive into it? So if you need to use the washroom, as I said, you can just go and use the washrooms at the end. There is coffee and hot chocolate and things like that. Let's start with some context and disclaimers. I can also show off like my Halloween-y spooky font, and that color there was supposed to be like pumpkin-y orange, but it actually, I don't know what it looks like, reddish. Yeah, liberal red. So appropriate. In any case, so I'm Paul. I bet you everybody here wants to hear the talk of how do we force the liberals to give us proportional representation. That would be an amazing talk. I don't know how to give that talk. Maybe one of you can give that talk. This is a talk that's mostly about how some different countries and places have achieved proportional representation in the sense of what happened in order for them to get it and sort of what happened afterwards. So that's going to be the focus. Another talk that lots of people want is how do all the different voting systems work? Right? How does list PR work? How does mixed member proportional work? What about open lists versus closed lists and droop quotas and hair quotas and So that's an interesting talk. That can maybe be a different talk that somebody can give. It's not going to be this talk. I will have a few slides talking about some of the different proportional representation systems, but it's going to be small. So don't expect to come out of here being an expert on the different things that we could replace the current voting system with. The third point is pretty important. So this is mostly a lecture-y kind of talk, but I do want it to be interactive in the sense that if I'm losing you, or I'm going too fast, or I'm confusing you about something, then you should totally let me know. But these kinds of events tend to invite all kinds of strong-minded people who have very strong ideas about democracy. And then people sometimes have a tendency to sermonize and just go on and on and on. And I'm sure that none of you have ever been at talks like that, where somebody just keeps on talking and it's not the presenter. But the only crazy proportional representation person allowed to speak today is me. So also, if you are privacy-minded, there are a lot of cameras. There's a camera there and a camera there. And we're also recording audio. So those of you who are at the back, you will not be recorded. And those of you who are at the front, if you're scared of that, when the first past the post police come to collect us all, then you might want to move back. So those are the disclaimers about the talk. Let's give some disclaimers about me. So I am no expert. I'm not like some political science person. I just have an interest in this topic. Some of the things I'm saying might be wrong. They're probably wrong. Also, I'm not doing good research methods. Almost all my data is from Wikipedia, so that shouldn't count. Second point, I'm not an official member of Fair Vote Canada, which might be confusing to you because there's a few of you who might remember when I was a member of Fair Vote Canada way back in 2007. And this is not an official Fair Vote Canada talk. It's mostly a Fair Vote Canada talk, but there's a few things that I might be saying that are not Fair Vote Canada things. They're not Fair Vote Canada policy, and I'll try to let you know what they are. And then the Fair Vote Canada people in the room will take pitchforks to me after the talk in the parking lot. So, contents. So here's what the structure of the talk is that I'm hoping to give. I'm also worried about time, maybe I should tell you. So I'm hoping that there will be a good amount of time for us to discuss stuff. I have a feeling that might not be the case. I will definitely try and cut things off at 9. If there are, I don't imagine there will be, but if there's very enthusiastic interest in discussion, happy to stay here a little bit longer than 9:15, 9:30, but by all means, if you've had enough, then you should definitely leave by 9. But here's what I'm going to do. First is the traditional sermon that happens at all Fair Vote Canada talks, why first past the post is bad. Secondly, and this is going to be the bulk of the talk, I want to talk about 3 places where people actually managed to change the voting system away from first past the post to something else. The first is an African country called Lesotho. The second is in Scotland, where there are municipal elections. They've also have proportional representation for their kind of provincial elections. I won't talk about that too much. And the third is the example that everybody uses, which is New Zealand. So I'll talk about those 3. I will touch a little bit on what happened in Canada, but it's mostly very sad, so we won't spend too much time on that. I'll focus on British Columbia. I'll try to pull some lessons out and to sort of say, here are some things that I noticed that were similar about the different case studies and some things that maybe we can learn as we go forward. And then we'll talk a little bit about 2 things that are coming up, and one of which you all know that the Liberals have promised to give us something. And then there's also a municipal thing happening that I think is important. So that's the structure. Can I start by getting a show of hands? How many of you are already super into proportional representation? Oh dear, okay. How many of you have already had the first past the post is terrible spiel, either online or, okay, a bunch of you. And how many of you not? This is kind of new stuff to you. Good. Okay, so my intention was to make it more accessible to new people. New people, please do not hesitate, even though a lot of people who are enthusiasts put up their hand, do not hesitate to put up your hand and stop me when things are confusing, because I'm sure that things will be confusing. So let's start. What do we have now? What we have now is a system that's called first past the post. Here's the idea. So you have a bunch of ridings. And so we call them electoral districts, but I'll call them ridings. And then you have a bunch of candidates in each riding, right? And then you mark off your X, and the person who gets the most X's, they win the riding, right? So all of the people who hate proportional representation are like, this is so easy, this is so understandable. And then whoever gets the most ridings, they get their they get the most seats, and then they get to form the government, right? So easy. So what could possibly go wrong? So here's a graph, and I want to spend a little bit of time. I got a lot of graphs like this, and I want to spend a little bit of time showing you what's on this graph and how it works, so that some of the stuff that's coming future. So if you have questions or confusions, now's a good time to ask, or as soon as I've explained. You're bludgeoned. Should I turn the volume down? Okay. How's that? Nope. How's that? How's that? That's okay? Okay. Good. So this was the Canadian federal election in 2008. And the way this graph works is that I've got 2 bars per party, right? So we got the parties on the bottom, and we got 2 bars. The first bar is completely fake. That's the popular vote. And the popular vote is take all of the people who say voted for the Conservatives across all ridings, whether they won or not, and add them up. The second bar is the only thing that matters in first past the post, and that's how many seats each party won. Okay? And then there's this funny red line. So what's this funny red line? It's majority. In first past the post, this is the post. If you get above this, then you get a majority government, and then you get all the power, right? So then you can, the leaders, they kind of look up at the heavens and lightning comes down or something. So that's the post. You can see in 2008, you might remember, nobody got a majority, but the Conservatives got way more seats, or not way more, about 10% more seats than their share of the popular vote would indicate. And everybody else, except for the Bloc Québécois, got less, right? So typically what first past the post will do is you'll get a share of the popular vote. The first party that wins, the one that gets the most votes, usually gets a big boost. Everybody else, although it doesn't happen as much in federal politics, gets squished down. So this is a little bit down, but it's not as bad as it usually is in first past the post. You can see the poor NDP got 18% of the vote, and they only got 12% of the seats, so that's a fairly big squish. Bloc Québécois, what happened there? How come they got 10% of the vote, but they got 15% of the seats, right? They got more seats than the NDP, even though the NDP got more of the vote. And then, of course, there's the Greens who won nothing. So, how many people think that they can explain why the graphs are doing this? Oh, not too many about that. Okay, so we'll spend some time looking at that. And then, how many people think that they can explain why the NDP and Bloc Québécois are the things they want? Or if not explain, understand intuitively? A little bit? Yeah, okay. So we'll talk about this. Spoiler alert, the answer is Quebec. Okay, let's look at 2011. So here was the Conservative majority. Conservatives got their big boost. They got 53.9% of the seats on 39.6% of the vote. NDP actually did something unusual. They got more seats than their vote would indicate, even though they came in second. So that usually doesn't happen, but it happened in this case. Bloc Québécois got squished. Liberals got squished, right? And this was the election that, I don't know if everybody in this room, I hope not everybody in this room, but a bunch of people were mad about. They were like, oh, those Conservatives, 60% of the people didn't vote for them, and yet they got their majority, right? And so that's a fairly typical result, which happens in Canadian politics. So are we understanding what all the components of the graph are? Can I clarify anything at this point? Okay, so this was 2011, right? You may have heard that we just had an election. Oh, did you have a question? No? Okay. So you may have heard we just had an election, and then I gratuitously stole some headlines. So we saw Justin Trudeau pledges real change as Liberals leapt ahead to a majority government. Trudeau scores a stunning Liberal majority. Liberal leader Justin Trudeau wins Canada's general election in a landslide that ends 9 years of Stephen Harper's Tory rule. So this was some landslide, right? This was incredible. So here's the 2011 election again. And now let's look and see what the landslide for the Liberals looks like. So let's go back again. Conservatives, Liberals, landslide victory, right? It's basically exactly the same thing. In fact, it's very, very close. The Conservatives got 39.6% of the vote, and the Liberals got 39.5% of the vote, right? Now, if you look carefully, the seat totals are not exactly the same because they increased the number of seats, but the share of the seats is about the same, right? So the stunning, there are other reasons why people think it's a stunning Liberal majority, because many of the people who didn't vote for the Liberals are happier with the Liberals than the Conservatives. But from the perspective of first past the post, it was a very similar type of election, right? Now, let's look at vote distortions, which is the first big problem of first past the post. And I was showing you a little bit of that already in the graphs. So winning parties usually get a big boost, right? And we saw that in 2008, 2011, they get their majorities. Hooray! Parties that don't form the majority, they get squished typically, right? So the classic case of this is the Greens, but then the NDP in this election and the Liberals in last election, they got way fewer seats than their share of the vote would indicate. Unless they win Quebec. So in Quebec, it seems that whoever wins Quebec, this time the Liberals got a lot. Last time it was the NDP, and the time before that it was the Bloc Québécois. They seem to do better than expected. So what is causing that? Well, what's causing that is first past the post. Let's look at a typical riding. So here is a riding with some fictional parties, party A, B, C, and D. Party A gets 40% of the vote, and party B gets 30, 20, 10, right? So this is not a completely out of place result that you might expect. So who wins the riding? Easy question. Party A. I made it red. Who did all the people who voted for party B? Who did they help elect? The trash can? They helped elect nobody, right? Their votes did not actually help anybody get elected, right? So in Fair Vote Canada land, we used to call this wasted votes. So all these people who voted for party B, C, and D, we call them wasted votes. The Green Party has tried to redefine this so that wasted votes doesn't mean this anymore, because no vote is ever wasted. But in Fair Vote Canada land, we're going to call these wasted votes, right? Because they don't help anybody get elected. Yeah. So there's, yeah. So the comment is maybe you can argue that 69% of the vote is wasted, or almost 70, because party A only needed 30% of the vote plus one, and then the rest are kind of surplus votes, right? You can definitely argue that. There are voting systems that take that into account. First past the post doesn't, right? And so in this talk, I'm mostly going to be concerned about all of these parties who don't help anybody get elected. You can also make an argument that party A, the extra surplus vote, you should do something about that. And there are voting systems that will take that into account. We won't look at them much today. Okay? Are we good? So there's this idea of a wasted vote, and so boo-hoo, these guys are losers, and who cares about the losers, right? Why does that still produce these distorted results? Well, don't just look at one riding, because one riding, maybe this is an acceptable result. Somebody has to be the winner. Why shouldn't it be party A? Let's look at all of these different ridings. So here's some four fictional ridings, right? In every riding, party A gets 40% of the vote. Therefore, they got 40% of the vote overall, right? There's 4 ridings. How many ridings did they win? Did party A win? It won 75% of the ridings. Why? Because ridings are not independent from each other. If I'm in Kitchener Centre and I'm voting for the Liberals, probably somebody in the Waterloo riding has the same sort of sentiment, right? We think about this. There is regionalism, but as a whole, there are trends. So if the trend is that many people support party A, then party A will tend to get it'll tend to come in first, maybe just by a little bit, in a bunch of different ridings. And that's why first past the post will tend to give a big bonus to the parties that get more than that finish first, because they tend to finish first in a lot of ridings. And why doesn't that get evened out by the other ones? Because all of these guys, their vote doesn't help anybody win, right? So that's the way, and that's the reason that first past the post does what it does. The other thing that's interesting to note is that first past the post really cares about your geographic distribution. If you get a lot of people in one riding voting for a particular party, that party will win a lot of seats, right? Or in that one riding. But if you have a geographic area where a lot of people tend to vote for one party, that party will win a lot of seats. And that explains Quebec, because Quebec is a geographic region. It's the votes tend to be the same across Quebec. So whoever wins Quebec tends to get a big boost, even if they don't win the overall, they're not the overall winner of the election, right? So that's maybe confusing. Is there anything that I can clarify? I'm seeing some blank faces, but I don't know if you're blank or just engaged. Okay, stop me later if you're confused, because this is actually the key problem with first past the post that people see. Is that it throws away a bunch of votes, and then across ridings, it's got these funny effects. Do you have a question there? So are you asking whether Canada is different than the other provinces? Yeah. So Quebec will not win an election on its own, but it's got a lot of seats that's in a geographic concentration. Yep. So the question, if I understand correctly, the question or criticism is if you use this argument to explain first past the post for other regions like Ontario or BC or something, well, Ontario doesn't have a Quebec. So what happens there, right? And so what tends to happen there is that your first party gets big and then everybody else gets squished. In federal politics, because Quebec and also to an extent Alberta, the other parties, the party that wins those regions because they're a big concentration will tend to get a boost and then everybody else will get squished, right? Okay. Are we okay with that? Okay. Okay. Yep. So let's talk about a different problem. So that was distorted votes. The first place party gets a big win. Everybody else gets squished. Here's another problem that you may be familiar with. Vote splitting. Namely, I don't know if any of you saw this. I guess I'm picking on poor Raj Sani. I got this in the mail, and it was a great big news flash because I didn't actually know that in my riding, Stephen Harper was running 3 times for 3 different parties. I mean, I thought robocalls were bad, but there you go. So what's going on here? Well, it's not actually the case, as far as I know, that Stephen Harper was winning 3 times. What the Liberals were trying to say is that if you vote for anybody but the Liberals, you're actually helping the Conservatives, right? Anybody here face that dilemma during this election? Oh, who should I vote for? If I vote for the party I really want, then the party I really want won't get in, and my opponents will get in. Therefore, I have to vote for somebody I can tolerate but not really like, right? Okay, so this was a special case. This never ever happens at other times, not like this. So this is another piece of literature that I've got. That I kept, and you can see, I don't know, you probably can't see, on June 28th. Oh wait, our election was in June 28th. At least this year's election was in June 28th. There's a little graph here that says Compass, June 14th, 2004. Oh, it's not 2004. What's going on? Well, it turns out the Liberals gave exactly the same argument in 2004. They said, oh, if you don't care who wins the election, then sit on the sidelines by not voting or vote NDP or Green Party. They have their merits, but a vote for either will do nothing to reduce the chances of a right-wing Harper government. Basically, they're saying, vote for us or your opponent is going to get in, even if you don't like us that much, right? And then they'll turn around and then when they win, they're like, we got a super strong mandate. Everybody loves us. And that's a thing that happens as well, right? So that's vote splitting, and that's a pretty big problem. And I think in this election, this stressed out a lot of people. Now, I don't want to pick on the Liberals too much because you might also remember this, which worked out really well for the NDP. The NDP only need 35 more seats. The Liberals need 100, right? They were trying to say you should park your vote with the NDP and not the Liberals because they'll get their 35 seats and they won't happen to lose a bunch more in Quebec. And then they'll win the government. Again, they're appealing to something that's vote splitting. Don't vote for the party you really want. Vote for the party that you can tolerate the most so that the one you can tolerate the least doesn't get in. And that's a thing that happens. And that's something that we don't like about first past the post. Okay, so this is all stuff that tends to happen as a matter of course, right? It always ends up being like this. But there's other interesting effects that I would like to talk about, other interesting outcomes, and those are actually relevant for the stories that I would like to share. Here's the first, lopsided victories. So what is a lopsided victory? Well, let's go back to the example of where you had 4 ridings and Party A got 40% of the vote. And then, oh, Party C, they got 45%, so they beat Party A, right? So that's pretty lopsided. That's 75% of the ridings on only 40% of the vote. Well, what's to stop us from having this situation where in this riding, it wasn't Party C that won, they just came a little bit below and Party A got everything, right? Now, I know what you're saying. Paul, you're making up fictional synthetic examples. I don't believe this can ever happen in real practice, right? No, not at all. It wouldn't happen in Alberta in 1979 and a bunch of other times in Alberta, where the Conservatives here won all 74 seats, and then everybody else got 5 between them, right? So there's your loyal opposition of 5 people, and then 74 people, 74 politicians in front, right? So of course that would never happen, except that it did happen. So now let's pause and let's ask a question. Who cares? You're past the post, right? So you already got all the power. You got veto power. You can pass whatever legislation you want. You can veto whatever private members you want. Let's ask a serious question. Why do you even want any opposition? What's the difference between having 5 seats of opposition and having 40 seats of opposition? Bob? So with a wider number of parties in opposition, you get a wider range of ideas presented. So that's a good reason. Are there any other reasons? Committees, right? So these parties, they work in committees to pass legislation, right? So all of the committees that the Alberta government in 1979 would have passed would have had mostly Conservatives there, right? And there weren't really enough of other people to pass around. Yep. Right. So job experience. If you have some people in opposition, they can learn about the different portfolios and they can learn about the job so that next time they can say, yeah, you should elect us. We already have experience in these portfolios, right? So you can't say that here. So those are 3 good reasons. Yeah, another one, Robert. Great. So resources are allocated according to the number of seats, right? One good example of that is question period, for example, right? In question period, how many questions do you get to ask? Well, you're allocated questions according to your share to whether you're opposition, right? Or how many seats you got, how much power you got. Yep, Sharon. So it is also true that 43% of the Albertans did not support the Conservative government. And they don't get to make those decisions, right? Well, they got 5 people to go to, right? So that's a lot of representation. So is that what you want from your democracy? I guess, maybe not. Here's another graphic, and this shows another province, Prince Edward Island. Now, this is a slightly different graph than the other ones. I stole it from Wikipedia. The blues here are the Conservative share of the seats, and the reds here are the Liberal shares of the seats. And you can see in PEI what tends to happen. There's these kind of streaks where one party gets almost all the seats and the other one doesn't. And then they switch, right? So then in here, it's almost all Liberals and not very many Conservatives. And so PEI is one province that tends to go back and forth, back and forth. One party gets almost everything, and then the other party gets almost nothing. And third parties almost never get a seat. There's one little seat over there that's supposed to be orange, right? So that's a thing that happens. But can it get worse? No, it can't get worse. Oh, wait. In 1987, we have the Liberals, Frank McKenna Liberals. And then if you're really talking about, well, you don't even have 5 people to go to because the Liberals won all the seats, right? Which was made question period very interesting. Or it would have, I'm being a little bit facetious here because they actually recognized that was a problem. And so they said, hey, Liberals, you Liberals here, you can pretend to be some opposition so you can actually ask questions, right? So they dealt with it a little bit, but it's still the case that nobody else got any say. And this can happen. So okay, fine. You can get these lopsided majorities because first past the post gives a big boost to the winning party, right? And typically the rule is if you get 60% of the vote, you generally get almost all of the seats. And if you get 40% of the vote, then you get a majority, right? Those are the rules of thumb that people use. Okay, but surely, Paul, that's the end of it. Surely it can't get worse Surely you can't have the wrong people winning. Now, that's a pejorative term. I shouldn't say it's wrong way winners. I should say it's a second place plurality. So let's look at this graph. So this is Quebec in 1998. Again, we got our graphs, but here the first place in votes did not actually get more seats. The second place party in terms of votes, 43.6, 42.9, pretty close, but still the second place got more seats and got to form the government, right? Well, that's democracy. That's the people gave a clear mandate to the bloc, to the Parti Québécois to form the government. You can tell because they got fewer votes but more seats. And that's what First Past the Post is capable of doing, right? Okay, I cherry-picked one example. That can't happen again. Oh, here's New Brunswick again, and it happened again in 1974 in New Brunswick. Oh, but that can't happen again. Oh, it happened again in New Brunswick. This time the Liberals won, and then the Conservatives did not. And you can see they're fairly close. But it's still the case that the party that gets the more votes wins fewer seats and doesn't get to form the government, doesn't even get the opportunity because they're the opposition. Yep. So Bob wants to know how that can possibly occur. So remember, First Past the Post cares about geographic concentration, right? So what happens in geographic concentration? Well, if I, as the second place party, can win by just a little bit in a bunch of ridings, and then the one that gets the more votes in the ridings when they win, they really win, and in other ridings they don't do very well, then this could happen. The other way that this can happen is vote splitting. So what you can have is in this case, it probably wasn't vote splitting, but you can have a third party that splits away votes and causes the party with the most vote actually to lose a bunch of ridings just by a little bit. Yep, Bob? Unequal distribution of voters in a riding, yeah, so that can be a case as well. There are ranges to which Elections Canada allows numbers of voters, but there's obviously some pretty sparsely populated areas of Canada in which there's not enough people, unless you want big gigantic ridings, even bigger than some of the ones now. Like Northern Ontario, for example, has do giant ridings, too big to walk the entire riding when you're canvassing. Okay, are we okay with? Well, I'm sure we're all okay with wrong way winners, but are we okay with the content of the slide? Well, okay. So can it ever happen? So this is supposed to be about. We just have a federal election. Can never happen federally. Not a wrong way majority, but we have had a wrong way plurality. Which means that they almost got enough seats, even though they were quite. This is almost 4% difference in votes, right? And this you might remember. People in Fairvote Canada, I guess, don't like to talk about this example a whole lot. This was 1979. Anybody remember what election that was? Nick wasn't born then. That was Joe Clark. Joe Clark and Justin Trudeau's dad. So Joe Clark's government did not last that long, and then Justin Trudeau's dad won again, but it's still an example where the party that got fewer votes, in this case quite a significant, got more seats. So that's a thing that can happen in First Past the Post. So what have we learned? What I hope you've learned is that winners usually get exaggerated, losers usually get squished. You get a lot of vote splitting and strategic voting, which those of us who don't necessarily support the main street parties don't like. Sometimes you get these lopsided majorities, little to no opposition, and sometimes the party that wins the popular vote loses the election. And I mean, there's a lot of other things that people can say about First Past the Post. That's probably enough for the kinds of stories that I'm hoping to say. And then, I don't know if you were looking at this webpage on election night. I unfortunately was refreshing it too much. This was the CBC election dashboard, and it said something very interesting that I think summarizes this very well. I have it on the vote share, and down here, I saw this. Popular vote does not determine the outcome of the election. Even though they graph popular vote, even though all the polls talk about popular vote, it does not determine the outcome of the election. Show all parties. So that is the summary that I have for First Past the Post. So shall we pause here? Any other sort of concerns or questions about this material? Yeah, Larry. Are you asking whether we can get rid of popular vote? I guess we could get rid of popular vote, but it seems to be a fairly reasonable way to measure how people feel about the government, right? So there are some systems that will take popular vote into account. But in terms of dispensing with it, I guess, but it makes it for a harder narrative, right? Like, because then the CBC is like, oh, in this riding, this person's leading, and then this riding is this person's leading. No, they just want to say the Conservatives are ahead or the Liberals are ahead overall. Yeah, so popular vote is definitely a media talking point. Yeah. Do you have, did I see another hand go up? You changed your mind. Good. Okay, that's allowed in voting. Okay, so what else is there? So this is the part where I race through a few different alternatives to first past the post, but I won't explain them in detail. And I'm expecting not everybody who's new to this is going to follow every part of this. That's kind of okay. So there's all kinds of voting systems that we could choose as alternatives. Some of them are proportional, and therefore Fair Vote Canada likes them. Some of them are non-proportional. Two of the most common ones that you hear in proportional are mixed member proportional, which some of you might remember from the debacle in 2007. And I'm going to abbreviate that MMPR. Usually it's abbreviated MMP, but people tend to get that confused with another acronym for Member of Provincial Parliament. So I'm going to go with MMPR. And then there's single transferable vote, which is a kind of vote where you rank candidates. And there is an example of a system where you do take into account the surplus votes. There's also non-proportional systems. There's instant runoff voting, also called preferential voting, also called alternative vote. There's got a bunch of names, and that's a non-proportional system. And then there's also parallel voting, which is kind of like the evil version of mixed member proportional. Won't get into that very much at all, but that's also a thing that exists. So I'm going to talk about three voting systems, one slide each. So mixed member proportional, how does it work? Basically, you have the same kinds of ridings that you do now, and each place elects one politician basically the same way that you do now. But there's this distortion between the popular vote and the number and the local riding results. So what you do is you keep track of part of popular vote explicitly. Usually you have a separate check mark that you do for the party that you support. Then what you do is that gives you a distortion. Now what you do is you just even out the distortion by having some extra seats, which I call top-up seats, and you give them out to the parties so that they can have a number, a proportion of the seats that's roughly equivalent to the proportion of the popular vote, right? So that's the idea behind mixed member proportional. There's lots of details that you can go into it. I have a couple of graphs where they actually show that in action. Yep. No, you usually, well, locally, there's people representing the party exactly the way you do now. So you have local candidates because people use it because they like still having local representation. Yeah, it is kind of. So independents can still run in the local ridings, and that's allowed, although they usually don't win, just like they usually don't win now. But the party, this is really a voting system that cares a lot about proportions of people supporting different parties, right? And so the list seats, the extra top-up seats, they can be for an entire region, or they can sometimes be for a local place, or they can be for the entire thing. So for the entire jurisdiction. So in 2007, I believe the mixed member proportional system they proposed, they would have had extra top-up seats for the entire province. But then you could find somebody who was close to you, who supported the, who liked the party, whose party you liked, or who you liked as a candidate individually, and go to them with your problems in addition to the local candidate. Instant runoff voting. So this is one of those non-proportional systems. This is where you have a ranked ballot. And what that means is that you say, this is my first choice, this is my second choice, this is my third choice, this is my fourth choice. And then what they do is they say, does anybody have 50% plus one of the vote? If so, they win. If not, take the one who has the least votes, get rid of them, and transfer their second and third choices to the other candidates, right? And so what this avoids, this solves exactly one problem, and as far as I can tell, only one problem. It solves the problem of vote splitting a little bit, but it doesn't solve the problem of vote splitting in the sense that people want. It still doesn't help small parties get elected, but it would help, say, so Raj Saini would not have to send out that you can't vote for the NDP, otherwise the Conservatives will win. There's a related system called single transferable vote, which is similar. Again, you have a ranked ballot. The big difference here is that you have a riding, but the riding has multiple seats. So locally, what you can think of as a good example of that is regional council. If any of you know of regional council, in regional council in Kitchener, there's 4 seats. And so you vote for a bunch of candidates, and right now the ones with the top 4 would win those seats. So that's a thing that can exist. You have multiple people, and then again you use the ranked ballot, but then, and again what you do is you drop the lower ranked candidates and redistribute them until you've filled up the seats. And if you have extra surplus people who, like somebody gets 70% of the vote, you'll take whatever part of the vote they don't need to win, and then you redistribute them down. So it's kind of got 2 parts to it. And the idea behind this, it's not an explicitly proportional system in that it doesn't care about parties, but it does care about making as many votes as possible help elect somebody. So to minimize the number of wasted votes. Okay? So those are 3 other voting systems you will hear about. They kind of come up in the examples, and that's why I am going through them. But I also understand that trying to explain them in one slide is not really sufficient to really get it. It helps to have graphs and stuff. But again, that's not really the purpose that I had behind the talk. Yep. Are there any systems in which there's no Yes, there are systems in which there are no candidates. Some, but they're not very common. They're called list proportional representation systems. And so in some of them, even in those, you can order your candidates within a party, and in some of them, they have the option of the party. Yeah, it's possible to have such a system. Yeah. Yeah. So that's the proportional systems that I'm going to talk about. Now I want to get into some case studies. Okay. So let's start talking about Lesotho. So what's Lesotho? Where's Lesotho? Lesotho is an African country. It's kind of completely surrounded by South Africa. And they switched from first past the post to a mixed member proportional system in 1998. Now, I'm not sure that there's a lot of lessons that we can draw directly into the Canadian experience, but I think it's very interesting as an example because they solved a problem. Their voting system change actually solved a real problem they were having. Now, before I get into the example, I do want to make a caveat. We have this really bad habit here of having like one of 2 narratives about Africa. Like, oh, those Africans are all backwards and they can't do anything right. Or, oh, those Africans are all oppressed and let's feel sorry for them. I'm hoping that by going through this example, I'm not going to be adding to either of those 2 narratives. But it is true that Lesotho's had its share of rocky experiences with first past the post and with their voting system. So it's a small country, 2 million people. They've been independent from Britain since 1966, and there's a whole lot of parties. Really, there's kind of 2 parties, and then one party keeps on splitting. So you're going to see, and I'm not expecting you to remember these, but there are some acronyms. LCD, BCP, BNP. So BNP is kind of the opponent of the BCP. BCP kind of switched off to LCD, and then LCD kind of splintered off into these ones, the All Lesotho Convention and the Democratic Conscience. So you're going to see these in terms of being the one parties that win a lot. I'm not expecting you to memorize what the names are. Just be aware that these parties exist. So let's look at some history. So 1966, Lesotho gained independence. 1970 was the first elections after independence. The BNP, so the Lesotho National Party, was in power at the time. They lost the election. And then kind of unfortunately, they said, we need a state of emergency. Those people didn't really win the election. And then they imprisoned everybody. And then there were no more elections for a while. Until 1985, when the BNP was still in power because they imprisoned the opposition. They supposedly held an election, but none of the other parties refused, all the other parties refused to participate. So, surprise, they won all the seats. So these were kind of not very well done elections. That was 1985. Then in 1986, there was more drama. There was a military coup. The military took over, still no elections. 1991, there was a change of power, and then the military said, yes, there should be elections. So in 1993, there was a first past the post election, because that serves us well in many countries like the UK and the US and Canada, and it was won by the opposition, the BCP. 1994, another coup having to do with kings and sort of succession rights. But what they did is, so this was the party in power. This was the opposition who was originally imprisoned. They had some negotiations, and then they were still in power. Then there was an election in 1998, and that's really where the story begins. So the elections were judged to be free and fair by international observers, and also a paper I read, so therefore it must be true. And this is what happened. So this was 1993, and you can see that it wasn't quite good opposition. This was kind of a lopsided victory. And the BCP, the main opposition party, these were the guys who were in power. 0 seats, 0 seats, 0 seats. Oh, look, all the seats go to one party. That's kind of lopsided. But maybe it's going to be better in 1998, right? The free and fair elections, this is not going to happen anymore. Oops. Now this time, the LCD, which split off from the BCP, they got all the seats but one. And then the BNP got 1 seat, and they were not very happy. They were like, this is a stolen election. But they didn't actually know that sometimes first past the post just does this. So first past the post just did this, and people were really kind of upset. And then they organized some mass protests and demonstrations, and then things got kind of rowdy, and troops came in, and people died. So that was not a very good outcome. And so there was all of this turmoil. There's an organization called the Southern African Development Community. They said, hey, there's trouble here. We'll bring in an interim government. And so they brought in an interim government, and the interim government said, hey, we can't allow this first past the post thing to keep on electing these lopsided majorities. Maybe we can come up with something better. So what they did is they invited representatives from 12 political parties to come together and choose a different voting system, or see how they could work on this conflict without more people dying. So what did they do? Well, later that year, they did choose a system. They chose the mixed member proportional system, and they had 80 seats that were riding seats, just like the ones they had now. And then they had 40 of those top-up seats that they could give to people whose votes were squished. Okay? So what happens then? What happens then is the first election. So this election actually looks very much like the 1998 election, in that the LCD won almost all of the seats. These are all riding seats they won. Their opposition, their main opposition, the BNP, didn't win any riding seats. These kind of hash marked, these are all top-up seats, right? So this is kind of how mixed member proportional works. You win whatever riding seats you won, and they won a big boost, but then there are some extra seats that are used to even things out. Without these extra seats, the LCD would have had its bar right up there, and there would be no opposition, right? So here's a situation in which first past the post would have given one party all of the power and no opposition, and a more proportional system didn't make it perfectly proportional, right? There's still disjunctions there, but they have other parties that have a significant amount of power. Then people got wise. People in the LCD said, hey, we're not winning any list seats. This is not good. We want list seats and riding seats. So then there were shenanigans, and this is a crazy graph. Here's the shenanigans. What happened was that the LCD paired up with another party, the NIP, and what they said is, hey, voters, give us all of your riding votes for the local candidates, and give all of your party votes to our friends. And then we'll get all of these seats and all of these seats. and we'll have all the power. And then their opposition, which at this point was the ABC, the All Basotho Convention, which kind of split off from them, they had to do the same thing. They said, oh, give us all your riding seats, and then we'll give our friends in this LWP, Lesotho's Workers' Party, some extra votes, right? So then basically there's kind of only two parties at play here, but it's not a very proportional result at all, right? Basically, the LCD gets 0 party vote, which is a pretty good thing. Lots of voting. Yep. Why does it matter whether your seats are riding and top-up seats? It doesn't necessarily. In some systems, it matters a little bit because they think of your riding seats as being your local constituent, and then all the people in the top-up seats might be from far away, right? So that's one reason. It doesn't matter usually in terms of, like, you can make mixed member proportional systems in all different ways. Usually they're equivalent in Parliament. So a riding representative is the same as a top-up representative. Yeah. Vote for this other part. And the idea is that the LCD wanted more seats than they were really entitled to, right? So if all of these were actually LCD votes, then they should be entitled to about 50, I think that's 51.8, so 52% of the seats. Instead, they get all of these plus all of these, which gives them way more power. Yeah, that would give them more seats and give them more power, right? So that was kind of unfortunate. We can go into the mechanics of this trick, but I don't think I want to. Instead, I want to continue with the story because it does get a little bit better. So there were shenanigans, right? So what happens is that in 2007, there's shenanigans. And then after that, and this is a very important point, people, I don't know exactly who, I was trying to look this up and couldn't find information. The system is reformed, and I don't know who reformed the system. I'm guessing it wasn't the leading party, but maybe it was, to kind of stop this trick from happening. So now they couldn't do this trick anymore. So what happens next? Well, there's more elections in 2012 and then 2015, but in between, there's another bad things that happens. There's allegedly another attempted coup and the prime minister frees the country. So what I'm trying to say here is, even though they switched to a proportional system, it didn't solve all of their problems. They still have some issues, but now they have elections like this. So this is what you'd expect more often in a proportional system. This is from 2012, and you can see the Democratic Congress here got a bunch of seats, and then they got a few top-up seats, and it sort of evened things out. So things look pretty even. There's actually a lot more parties here who get seats than many people who are MMPR advocates would like, but it seems to work out okay for them. And then there was some coalition between these two parties to form the government. Similarly, in 2015, they had another election, and you can see that it's kind of a very similar story in the sense that now it's much more proportional, but more important for Lesotho, there's some opposition. It's not all one party anymore. Yep. There are coalitions in this government. Do I know how the coalitions were formed? I don't have that written down, no. But I know, like, so these guys and these guys, the DC and the LCD, I think they formed a coalition in this case, right? And there weren't that many other partners in the coalition. So if they form a coalition, they will get the majority to rule. Yep. Would they be allowed to govern in a minority government? I don't see why not. Like, I mean, I don't know the details of exactly what they were doing in this scene. It was a little bit hard to find some information on this particular study. There haven't been a lot of papers and stuff written on it, but in principle, I think that could work, and that works in some other countries. Okay. So let's talk. Okay, so how did they win proportional representation? They had a couple of crazy elections and people were not happy. And then there was civil unrest and people died, which was not a very good result. as I said, not a Fair Vote Canada member. I don't know what Fair Vote's official policy is on people dying in order to get first past the post gone, but I'm not in favor of that. Then they had some all-party committee, and the all-party committee came and they made a fairer system. They had some problems with it. There was this weird result with the shenanigans, and then they fixed it, right? So it's the case that even though you get first past the post, it can be gone, then it can be reevaluated. Byron. That was imposed by an outside authority because there was this civil unrest. Yeah. So that outside authority was a collection of nations. Even though it seems to have South Africa in the name, it's not just South Africa. It was a bunch of nations that came in, right? Yep. Yeah. Right. So Lesotho was a member of this outside group that was coming in. Okay. Other things? Did you have a question, Isaiah? Same thing? Okay. So let's go on to the next one. This is Scottish municipal elections, and I've only got a couple of slides, a few slides on this. I didn't go into very much detail. There's probably a lot of interesting things in this, though. So there's Scotland. Scotland switched from first past the post to single transferable vote in 2007. That's the one where you have ranks and you have multiple candidates. So what did they happen? Well, the backstory behind this is that Scotland is like the Quebec of the UK, and they always want to separate. So they were working on what's called Scottish devolution. So that's a step. That's kind of turning Scotland into a province, I guess, is the best analogy I can come up with, but it's probably not a very good analogy. Basically, the UK had all the power and was doing all of the decisions for Scotland. Scotland wanted more of its own power, so they went through this process called devolution. And how did this happen? Well, actually, it happened in a funny order. First, there was a paper published that said, if we were going to have a Scottish parliament, how would it look? And in this, they introduced a proportional system. They started off with a proportional system. So in this case, they're not switching from first past the post. They're kind of just starting with something that's proportional. And then in 1997, the Labour government in the United Kingdom said, hey, let's have a referendum. And the referendum passed. And so then there was going to be a Scottish parliament. So that's kind of the backstory. So right now, what we've got in Scotland on the kind of provincial level, on the Scottish level, is you have a government that has proportional representation. And proportional representation means you usually don't get outright majorities. So then what happens? On the Scottish level, Labour formed a coalition with the Liberal Democrats, which as far as I can tell is their version of the NDP. And as a condition of this coalition, the Liberal Democrats said, hey, we want to have proportional representation on the municipal level, right? Now, that may seem a little bit weird to us because at least locally, we don't have parties at the municipal level. And thank goodness. There, they use parties at the municipal level. So you'll have Liberal Democrat people running for councillors or mayors or whatever. And so it was being disproportional there. The Liberal Democrats apparently thought that it wasn't fair that Labour should win all of the municipal seats. And so they forced this condition. Then what did they do? Well, then they had they passed an act together, and then they legislated SDV, and then they had their first elections, right? And they've had, I think, one set of elections since. So I'm sure there was drama and stuff because when you start out, then there's always kind of drama when you switch a voting system. Although in the UK they use a lot of different voting systems for different levels of government. But I didn't get into the details too much. I just want to get into the punchline, which is how Scotland won proportional representation. So they had this long devolution campaign, and then they adopted proportional representation for the new parliament. That meant there were coalitions. Then the coalition partners said, hey, we need to have proportional representation on another level, right? So all the first past the post advocates will be using words like cancerous for this. But I think it's kind of neat that there's sort of this bootstrapping thing where you win it on one level, and then on other levels it kind of continues forward. Okay, New Zealand. Not surprisingly, I'm running past time, and it's 8 o'clock. So here's what I propose we do. Do people need a stretch break or a coffee break? Or do people want to keep on going? You want to keep going? Okay, so let's keep going. So I think I'm going to try and go through New Zealand at a reasonable clip, but this is by far the example that everybody knows the most about, and so there's lots of details here. I'm going to skim over some of those details. So here's New Zealand. So New Zealand switched from first past the post to mixed member proportional in 1993. What happened? So one background is that you're going to see that there's a lot of elections. That wasn't necessarily because New Zealand's government kept falling apart. It's because they hold elections every 3 years. And they decided to hold elections for every 3 years. And they've got lots of parties. Really, the only three parties that are most relevant are these three. Labour, which is kind of their leftish party. It's also red, which is convenient. So you can think of it as the Liberals. National, which is their kind of rightish party, and they have a nice color blue. New Zealand First, which is this other party that kind of started up. It's an anti-immigration party. It's kind of centrist. And then there's a few other parties here, including the Greens and ACT, who sometimes are involved with these slides, but you don't need to think about them too much. Think about Labour and National to begin with. So, 1978, they have an election. And what was this result? Wrong way winner, right? So what happened is that Labour got ripped off. They got more of the vote by about 1%. They lost the seats. Also, you know who else got ripped off? These guys, the social credits. They have social credits in New Zealand too, apparently. They had 16% of the vote, 1% of the seats. So that made people mad. But okay, it only happens once in a while. No worries. Oops, in 1981, their very next election, it happened again. And this made Labour pretty mad. It also made the social credit supporters pretty mad because they got 20% of the vote and 2 seats, right? That's even worse than the Green Party. So, what can we say about these two things? Well, they made Labour mad. And so Labour said, hey, we're keeping on getting ripped off. If we form the government, then we're going to implement proportional representation. Promise, promise, promise. So they did a royal commission in 1985. And then in 1987, they said, we're going to do a referendum to choose proportional representation. And then they didn't do it. And then that gave National a kind of, way in. They said, those lying Labour people, they never keep their promises. If you elect us, we'll do a proportional representation referendum. And then Labour accidentally also promised a referendum. So now you have the two major parties. They're saying, we're both going to do a referendum. Are they actually going to do a referendum? Let's see. Yes, they are. So in 1992, they were asked 2 questions. There was actually, they set up this referendum in kind of an interesting way. They had 2 parts. First part, they're going to have a referendum to ask 2 questions. First, do you want to keep first past the post? Second, let's say you don't want to keep first past the post. What should we use instead? Right? So that I think is very important because it actually splits this. For Fair Vote Canada and other proportional representation people, one of the things that we love to do is fight. STV is better. No, mixed member proportional is better. No, open list. We love to fight. And so we can't be coalesced on what system is best. But we can be pretty uniform that we don't like first past the post. So it was interesting that they split off these 2. So that's the first referendum. The second referendum they were going to hold a year later. If people wanted to change the system, then they would pick 2 alternatives, first past the post and another winner, and they would say, which of these 2 do you want? Right? So let's see what happened. First referendum. Do you want to keep first past the post? 15%. Do you want to change? 81% people wanted to change. And this is 1992 referendum, so still the first question. Part A, so that's the first question. Part B, here are 4 different systems. Which one do you like the best? And so it turns out that mixed member proportional happened to get not only the biggest number, but a majority. So that kind of tied their hands, right? I don't know what would have happened if all of these had been less than 50%, but clearly mixed member proportional was the winner in this case. So that's 1992. Pretty clear that people want to change. Pretty clear that mixed member proportional is the best alternative they can think of. So this means 2 questions was important. The New Zealand, how did people know about all these other 4 systems? The New Zealand government told them, sent them literature telling them about these 4 systems, right? And then for these referendums, this is a minor point in this case, but major when it comes to Canada. There was a 50% double threshold, which means they had to get 50% of the vote, and in 50% of the ridings, it had to get a majority, right? The idea there was that you wouldn't want in your major cities all of the support, and in the rural countries, nobody supported it. So that was the original impression. This will come back to bite us in Canada. So I also think, so I don't think that people were, like, I'm presenting it as if it was the wrong way elections that were the motivators. I also get the sense, although I can't prove this, is that people shockingly were mad at both Labour and National. They didn't like either. I don't know how that could happen. It would be like not liking the Conservatives or the Liberals. So 1993, what happened? They pitted first past the post versus mixed member proportional, and mixed member proportional won. Did it win 60% like it had to in Ontario? No, it won 53, but it was still a clear winner. Okay, so now we have a mixed member proportional system in New Zealand. Hooray! What happens? They have an election in 1996 and craziness happens. So this New Zealand First Party, they were like, National sucks. We hate National. Vote for us so that National won't get a winner. And then what happens? Well, National gets a plurality, so they got the most seats. And then New Zealand First said, hey, we're partnering with National. So that was sucky. That would be like the NDP saying, vote anti-conservative, vote anti-conservative, and then the Conservatives get the most votes and the NDP forms a coalition with them. So that made people mad. Then what happens? Labour wins, Labour wins, Labour wins. It's not looking too good for National at this point. So, right now, it looks like the first election was pretty rocky. Then it was kind of okay. And then Labour won. And they did this very interesting thing. They didn't form a coalition with all of the parties. There were 4 parties that they were partnering with. Labour and Progressive, which just had like 1 seat. And then this other thing called supply and confidence. And what supply and confidence is a very interesting idea. Basically, you're not in a coalition with us. You don't get to be in our cabinet. We don't have caucus meetings together. But whenever there's a confidence vote, like a budget, you have to vote with us, right? So there's different ways of doing this. You can have a formal coalition where we'll all govern together, or you can have the supply and confidence, which means we're going to make a deal that for the life of this, you're going to have to vote for us and we'll give you some concessions in return, right? So I think I have some graphs. Okay, so here's 1996. It's not perfectly proportional, but it's not bad. Here's New Zealand First. They partnered with National. Here's 1999. So in this case, Labour partnered with Alliance and the Greens, and that was enough to get them over, and that was a coalition government. No, 2002, it was Labour partnering with I can't remember, United Front, United Forward. And so those two formed, and then they also had supply and confidence from some other parties. And then Labour wins again, and they partner with the Progressives here, which just had 1 seat, but that was not enough to get them above board. So they also did supply and confidence with UF and Green. UF and New Zealand First. They were actually mad at the Greens over GMOs. They were fighting, so they weren't going to be partners there. Okay, so bunch of Labour wins. National's getting nervous. National says, okay, we won in 2008 and we are promising to reevaluate mixed member proportional. Well, it's not seeming to work so well for National, and they want all the power. They don't want just 44.9% of the power. So then it's referendum time again. So here's what they do. They promised the referendum in 2008. In 2011, there's a referendum. Mixed member proportional wins. And then in 2012, it won, so they're keeping it. But there were some problems with mixed member proportional that were causing a few crazy results. It had to do with how you get list seats. So they reviewed them, and then they changed mixed member proportional. So similar like the Lesotho case, there was a voting system put in place. There were some problems, made some people unhappy. And then what happens? They come in and fix it. Okay, The referendum questions, just quickly, very clear questions. Keep or change, 56%. This is actually higher than 53% won in the first referendum versus first past the post, and now 56%. And then the second referendum was still the same. They gave 4 alternatives, said which alternative do you want? Here are the 4 alternatives. These are the same three as before. First past the post. Of the people who cast legitimate votes, that was still the most popular. So it sounds like people are still have some residual love for first past the post. But look at this. The number in invalids were bigger than any of these. So it went a plurality. People were just like, I don't want to guess in this. I only want to keep mixed member proportional. So, yeah, I told you these 3 things already. So let's just go on. Okay, so in recent elections, is it going to be Labour forever? Are they just going to win every election? No. National has been winning elections recently, and they have been actually governing as a minority, which addresses your question, right? They've said, I'm going to govern as a minority. Nobody else gets to be in my cabinet, no formal coalitions, but I'm going to get supply and confidence from these 3 other parties. And they've done that the past 2 elections, and if we look at the results, still looks pretty proportional, right? There are actually wasted votes in the system, which is why they don't look that proportional. All of these votes here that were for other parties never elected anybody, but it's still pretty proportional. So I think at this point in New Zealand, mixed member proportional is here to stay, right? And it's pretty solid, and future governments are not going to be able to do very much to get rid of it. Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's fine. Okay, so how did New Zealand win proportional representation? They had 2 wrong-way winners that made the Labour Party really mad. So Labour had an incentive to get us to change the system. There was some government report and then foot dragging and election promises that they didn't keep. And then there were in 1992 and 1993, 2 successful referendums. And, oh, I guess I'm supposed to tell you, Federal Canada hates referendums. They lost 4. But I think that this was an example of referendums actually done fairly right, because there were good thresholds, the questions were clear, and they separated these 2 questions. Do you want to keep first past the post? What do you want to change to? Wacky coalitions, Labour governments, reevaluate the system, which was code for let's change it back. Another referendum, mixed member proportional won, and then they changed the system again. So one take-home message I take from this is even if your system is not perfect, it can be improved, or it can be discarded. Okay, Canadian time. So, trivia question. What has the closest Canada has come to winning proportional representation at any level of government? The first BC referendum is the closest they've come. Any other guesses? So there was some place where you actually had it and got rid of it? Yep. We've had proportional, surprise, we've had it. So, well, we haven't had it. In Manitoba, they had it. They used it in Winnipeg for the Winnipeg seats provincially. In Alberta, the Progressive Party had single transferable vote for Calgary and Edmonton and this instant runoff everywhere else. And then there was this little trendy spate back in the 1920s when municipalities switched to it, right? Awesome. We have proportional representation. Hooray! Oh no. Governments then took it away. So in 1959, the social credits got their majority and they said, no, this is too confusing, too hard to count. We want first past the post again. 1956, Manitoba does the same. Jennifer. Did they have referendums? They did not have referendums in these cases, right? It was exactly the same, the situation we have that's coming up. A party said, I'm going to change it. So a party changed it. Then another party got into power, changed it back. Right? The official reasons were that it's too hard to count. Computers have not been invented yet, and single transferable vote is hard to keep track of. Fair statement. We have computers now. Also, the way that they got Winnipeg out of single transferable vote is that you don't have enough seats. So if we go back to first past the post, you'll get more seats. You should not be complaining. The unofficial reasons, I'll leave to your judgment. Another interesting example, which I won't go into, is British Columbia, which did something very interesting between 1951 and 1953. Okay, let's talk more about British Columbia. Let me get water. Awkward pause. You can look at this graph. You know what this was. Wrong way winner, 1996. NDP got 39% of the vote, 52% of the seats. The Liberals got ripped off. They was mad. And they was saying, well, we're going to make proportional representation happen. We promise. And also, I think that this got some media coverage so that maybe even citizens might have been mad. Oops, here's another election. Liberals certainly made up for it. They got a lopsided majority. And then people also noticed this. And they said, I didn't know first past the post could do these crazy things. Maybe we don't want first past the post. And you can see the lovely opposition to NDP seats, and the Greens have done better than I think they've ever done, 12.4% in BC, and they got 0 votes. So those made people mad. So what do you do when people get mad? You make promises. The Liberals got their lopsided majority, and then in 2002, the Liberals, in BC, the Liberals are not really like Liberals. They're the right-wing party. They kind of shifted right after the right-wing parties all left. So they got Gordon Gibson of the Fraser Institute to recommend a citizens' assembly. What's a citizens' assembly? Out of every riding, you pick some people that are regular citizens, you bring them together, you ask them, what kind of voting system should we have? And so then they decide on a voting system, and then they take it to referendum. Except that, remember in New Zealand, they said 50% plus 1 plus 50% of the ridings. We said that's not democratic enough. You need 60%. So you need 60% of the vote and 60% of the ridings, and that's what democracy means. And so they imposed this actually fairly late in the citizens' assembly process. Some of the citizens in the citizens' assembly were caught off guard. And then the Citizens' Assembly recommended single transferable vote. So now we're going to have a referendum. Here's the referendum. Notice that this is kind of different than the New Zealand ones. They didn't ask, do you want to keep first past the post or get rid of it? And then which system do you want? They said, they said, we want to save money. We're going to say, hey, do you support this or do you oppose this, right? And they didn't win. They lost the referendum. They only got 57.7% of the vote. That's not enough to win a referendum. That's not democratic. So they got 57% of the vote, and they said clearly they don't want first past the post. They want this new system. But that wasn't enough to win. But it was still pretty high, especially given that any government that gets 40% of the vote gets their majority, right? So here's what happened. Premier Campbell and the Liberals were, oh no, this is not what happened. These are a couple of points I would like to make. So what did the parties do? The Liberals were officially neutral. The NDP was split. They had endorsed proportional representation in their caucus meetings and their policy platforms, but then they were split as to whether they actually wanted it. Because don't forget, the NDP can win majorities in BC. The Green leader just went crazy. She said, oh, I don't like STV. I like mixed member proportional. Why, I don't know, but then the Green Party beat her up a little bit or something, and so eventually she was on side, but it wasn't that good. This is the wrong voting system. And if you spend any time on proportional representation forums and stuff, you'll see that a lot. So 57.7% of the vote, even Premier Campbell said, you know, you lost, but it was pretty close. Hey, we'll change this. We'll actually tell you what the electoral boundaries are, which they didn't before, and we'll fund some pro and anti groups to actually do real campaigning. So they did. And now, what happened? Which electoral system should British Columbia use to elect members? This is actually a slightly different question. In the last one, first past the post was the second option. In this one, first past the post was the first option. And they voted pretty overwhelmingly to keep the system as opposed to using single transferable vote. And this was apparently a pretty hard fought thing. There were lots of accusations that one group outspent the other 5 times and things like that. But they lost pretty bad. And so for years, from the first referendum until the second referendum, fair vote people were like, yeah, we lost, but they won in BC, except that the threshold killed them. But then lost. PEI had a referendum, lost. Ontario had a referendum, lost. BC had another referendum, lost. So each one of these really hurt, right? There were also attempts in Quebec, which was abandoned in 2007, and New Brunswick, abandoned in 2006 after the Conservatives, who would put it in, lost with the wrong way majority, or wrong way winner. So, haha. There were also attempts there, and that was sort of the wave when everybody was thinking, maybe we can switch the system. And because people didn't actually vote for first past the post, not everybody voted for first past the post because they love first past the post. A bunch of people voted against mixed member proportional or single transferable vote because they were afraid. They didn't know, or they were unaware, or they had heard some bad things about unaccountable people, right? But in any case, all you need to do is look at these results for lost elections, and then what do the talking points become? They become the Liberals and NDP would make these democratic changes to our democratic system and impose them on Canadians without consultation. Because when Canadians are asked, as they've been asked in Ontario, British Columbia, and Prince Edward Island, they've chosen the status quo, right? So that becomes the talking point, and that really hurts people who would like proportional representation. And you will see that talking point come up a lot in the next little while. Okay, so pause here. Questions? How are we doing for time? 20 after 12? Yeah. Okay. Okay. So let's talk about some lessons. I've hinted at some of these lessons. You are totally allowed to disagree with these lessons, but these are the lessons that I came up with. First of all, wacky elections, lopsided victories, and one-way winners, those are motivating. Those motivate people. When first past the post acts crazy, then that's motivating. Splitting the vote and having these disproportionate results, yeah, I guess it affects the nerds, but it doesn't get wide media coverage. And we can hope that it's going to be different, but it's kind of business as usual, right? So that's something to be worried about. Inertia. This is a really important point. Moving away from first past the post is really hard because this is the system people have used and people think they understand. So moving to anything else, because no system is perfect. There are bad things you can say about every system, and the people who would like the status quo to stay the status quo will say, give you all of those bad points. But once you move, then you've kind of opened the box, the Pandora's box or everything, because then you will see regular attempts to either move back or change the system some more. So that's a good thing and a bad thing. It means that even if the system that gets proposed as a proportional system is not your favorite one, it can be improved in the future. It's bad because once you win proportional representation, it won't necessarily stay one, especially if there's powerful parties who think that they're losers in this, like, media companies and the Conservatives, right? Also, rejected electoral attempts, they hurt us, right? So every time we say, we don't like this because we don't like STV, or we don't like this because we don't like these closed lists, then that hurts us. So just keep that in mind. That doesn't say we have to support every proportional representation or non-proportional voting electoral change, but it means that we should be aware. Here's a lesson that everybody knows. Everybody knows that once you win an election under first past the post, you suddenly lose your enthusiasm for proportional representation, right? And so here are some of the ways that you can sabotage it. You can say, I'm officially neutral. You can say, well, 50% is not enough. You need to have 60% in order to win. Why 60%? Nobody actually knows. Maybe it's 10% more than 50. You can also drag your feet until it's too late. Yeah, we'll totally do this. We'll totally, time for election. Sorry, right? So there's a number of ways in which political parties can play shenanigans. Not that I'm saying our current political party will do any of this stuff, but it's possible. Here's a lesson. We should be careful about what we tell people about proportional representation, because the first few elections are likely to be rocky. There are likely going to be some hiccups in sort of developing the system and implementing the system. And so people will be mad after the first couple of elections. They will find ways that it gives them results that they weren't expecting. And then there will be some pressure to move back. Politics is still going to be politics, right? It's not going to be all clean and nice and everybody holding hands and not being competitive. Elections are still going to be elections. Politics are still going to be politics. Party partisanship is still going to be party partisanship. So we have to keep that in mind when we're proposing a new system. What does life under proportional representation mean? Well, it means that parties you don't like win power. And this is really a thing that we should think about, because there will be parties, if we have a proportional representation system, that people don't like, right? Right now, there's not a socially conservative party in this country, not a really powerful one, right? Well, they all park their votes with the conservatives, and the conservatives just kind of ignore them, because where else are they going to go? Under a proportional representation system, they'll make their own party. They'll have a place to go. So that's something that you should keep in mind. Proportional representation, because it doesn't give this big boost, it's harder to kick the rascals out. I'm using the word rascals, even though people use a different word, but this is PJ rated 13. So, coalition governments, post-election drama. So we have 11 horrible weeks of election drama, and then there will be some drama as the parties figure out who will be in coalition and who will be in supply and confidence. That first New Zealand election, I think it was like 2 months until they decided who was there. That's not going to happen every time. Once people figure out who their regular coalition partners are, then it'll be much faster. But again, rocky beginnings. And then first past the post offenders make some arguments that are worth considering and some arguments that are ridiculous. And so it's easy to laugh at the ridiculous one. Who's going to lose their seats so that a proportional person can get in? And there's some that are reasonable. Oh, it's going to make it harder to kick the rascals out, right? And so we have to be aware of that. Referendums. So everybody in Federal Canada hates referendums. I don't actually hate referendums entirely, although certainly I've not been happy with the Canadian ones. I think New Zealand did it right. I think that splitting up those two questions was a really smart thing to do. And the other thing is that once you have something passed by a referendum, it's not the case that the next party that comes into power can just undo everything. There's actually a little bit more staying power there, right? Okay, what comes next? So, how many people knew that in municipal level we're going to have the opportunity to use ranked ballots? Few people. And how many people didn't? Few people. Good. So there was a movement, I think it's mostly in Toronto, but they petitioned the government to say, allow us to rank our candidates. And the government said, sure. And then there was a feedback period at which some of us participated. And then I don't know exactly what's going to happen. I kind of have lost track of the story, but it looks very likely that we will be allowed, but not forced, to use ranked ballots municipally. And that's a good thing and a bad thing, because there are proportional systems that can use ranked ballots, and there are non-proportional systems that can use ranked ballots. Instant runoff voting is not the only one. There's a bunch of them out there. Which voting systems are we going to use? What will happen here? Will we be turning into using instant runoff voting municipally? Is that the worst thing in the world? Well, there's a lot of debate over that. And we should ask ourselves these questions, because this will come up and there will be the opportunity to go to regional council in the cities and say, please allow us to use ranked ballots. Then you have to decide, what levels of government do you want to use ranked ballots? Do you want to use it for mayors? Well, there's not much proportionality in the mayors. You're only electing one person. For city councilors, maybe, maybe not. If you use proportional representation for city councilors, they don't have parties, so that's one consideration. And instead of having one ward with a councilor, maybe you're going to have to put a bunch of wards together and have 5 people, right? People might not like that. People might not like that. Regional council is a place where I think it would be an easy transition to a proportional system, because there's already multiple people running for regional council, right? There's 2 people for Waterloo, 2 people for Cambridge, 4 people for Kitchener. So that's an easy way to get a more proportional system in. And what happens if we say, no, I don't like the fact that there's going to be instant runoff voting, so therefore I want to just use this old system? What are the implications of that going to be when we're talking about other proportional representation reform? And then, of course, there's the federal Liberal promise. We will make every vote count. I wonder where they stole that slogan from. We are committed to ensuring that 2015 will be the last federal election conducted under the first past the post system. But they didn't say anything about proportionality. There's nothing saying. Oh, okay. All-party parliamentary committee to review a wide variety of reforms, such as ranked ballots, proportional representation, mandatory voting, online votings. Then the committee will develop its recommendations, and then there will be a legislation. So no referendum, just legislation, right? They're evaluating all of these. They're not saying that they're going to do proportional representation. And they're just proposing this multi-party committee. Who's going to be in the committee? Who are the main parties that won power? Oh, the Liberals, the Conservatives, neither of whom is really into proportional representation. And then there's the NDP and maybe one Green member, because you can't have two Green members on the committee. So what's going to happen there? I don't know. I wish I could give that talk. So let's look at some of the factors that made other people switch and see whether those factors apply. Has there been an electoral capacity? No, Stephen Harper getting a majority doesn't count. That was regular. So no electoral capacity. Does Trudeau support proportional representation? It's not clear. Maybe he's had a change of heart when he was running for the leadership. I remember that he wasn't. He was in favor of this instant runoff voting. Do the Liberals benefit from proportional representation? Are they really mad because there's no proportional representation? They won a majority on 40% of the vote, and instant runoff voting, which is the thing that people are worried about, actually favors centrist parties. Why? Because who's everybody's second choice, right? It's the big centrist party. So if the Liberals can be the big centrist party, they would benefit under a non-proportional system. They weren't ripped off. They got their majority. And is the official opposition advocating for proportional representation? Can they hold them accountable? Not really. So this doesn't look super optimistic. But we might be able to do something. So I don't think we can force anything. We can, and as I said, I do not advocate, mass revolutions. So what else can we do? Keep your pressure. We have a bunch of Liberal MPs. We have some Conservative MPs. Can we go to them? Can we keep the pressure? Can we remind them that they're letting their feet drag on this? Can we tell them you don't get to sabotage this? Can we criticize attempts when they do try to sabotage this? They're going to try a bunch of things, maybe, unless they're not going to act in their own party's interests and just do the right thing, then they're going to try and sabotage this. Can we criticize that? Can we make it loud? Can we broaden support and awareness of electoral reform? My big hope was that like 90% of the people here would not already be in the cult of proportional representation. Didn't quite get that, but how can we make it so that all of your friends and neighbors who are really sick and tired, they've already had 11 weeks of a campaign, and voting is really nerdy. It's just for nerds, and why would you want to change these systems? And it makes my head hurt. How can you get them to care? Because I think it's true that if we don't broaden the people who know and care about this issue, that we're not going to be very likely to get that broad support that we need to hold the government to account. Because if it's just the same 10% of people or 5% of people, like the Green Party supporters alone and the NDP supporters alone are not going to be enough to make this happen. I would propose that we should take advantage of municipal election reform and implement some ranked ballots and proportional representation where it's appropriate. I don't know exactly where it's appropriate. I'm still trying to figure that out for myself, but you should think about that too. We should keep proportional representation multi-partisan. So Fair Vote Canada is an officially multi-partisan group. It's, in my opinion, and again, this is not official Fair Vote Canada policy, it's kind of drifted to the left, and I don't think that's a good thing. Because I think that for proportional representation to work, if you make it a polarizing topic, then what's going to happen is that there's a left-wing party that'll bring it in, and then a right-wing party will get in and take it out. And so I don't think that's the way to go. And I think that there are allies that we have. We have allies. I'm speaking as if we're all left-wingers, and I don't want to assume that because that's not true. But people on the left have allies. They have some allies in terms of a few people who are advocating for this, like Andrew Coyne. They have the libertarians who are often very much in favor of this. You have social conservatives, right? Maybe you don't like social conservative policies. They don't have a party to go to. So I think that there are some things that we can do to try and broaden this multi-partisan approach. And stop fighting. This is a really important thing. We love to fight. We love to argue. We love to say, if this is not exactly the system that I want, then I'm not going to support it. And I think that's a big mistake because we're not further ahead by choosing first past the post once again. Okay, How can we do these things? Those were all kind of abstract, and my answer is you already know how. I wish I could give you some magic thing to force the Liberals, or some magic thing that we can do to make this happen, but I can't. I can only give some suggestions. So learn for yourself. Can you explain first past the post? Can you go to other people and explain first past the post? Do you know what the trade-offs in proportional systems are? Are you okay with those trade-offs? One of the reasons I wanted to give a history talk and not an electoral mechanics talk is to sort of give a sense of other people have done this. It's not complete speculation. You can look at what other people do. You can't generalize them directly to our experience, but you can see what some of the other people have gone through. So that, I think, is a good exercise so that you're comfortable yourself saying that overall, I think that proportional representation is better than not proportional representation. And the third exercise that I think is very helpful is to ask yourself, democracy is a fairly, it's not a very well-defined term. So what do you actually want from a democracy, right? Do you want it, the parties that I like get in? Do you want it, the parties I don't like don't get in? Do you want effective opposition? Do you want parties to work together and cooperate more? Do you want good ideas to come up, right? There's a lot of different things that people want out of their democracies, and you have to sort of think, what are the things that I want out most? And that will sort of indicate what kind of voting systems will cater to that, and what will not. Get involved. Sharon wants 2 minutes at the end to tell you that there's going to be a meeting on November 9th at the Hoother Hotel on working with members of Parliament. I think that Sharon and her crew are going to go storming all the members of Parliament and tell them implement proportional representation, and they would love your support. There's a leadnow.ca campaign. You know the Lead Now people. They send you 1 million emails, half of which are asking for money. It's going to take money and it's going to take pressure in order to win this in a broad-based way. It's actually really exciting that they're getting involved. So you might go to their site and say, yes, I'm interested in proportional representation. Let's win this. You can have other local activities happen, right? So this talk happened. Other talks can happen. Given by other people who can explain things clearly, or given, maybe by me. We can have learning circles if you want to learn about all the different proportional systems. We can have proportional discussions. We can have public events, right? There's lots of different ways to sort of spread this word. This is a site that some of you may have seen. I saw this a lot this summer. This is Sharon, and she's at the booth of Fair Vote Canada going out to a bunch of summer events. And so I'd go out to these summer events, and then I'd walk up to Sharon, and I'd say, Sharon, you're all by yourself. And she's like, yeah, I booked the entire day. I just took it for myself, and I'm going to be here representing Fair Vote Canada. And I actually think this is awful. This is horrible. I thought Fair Vote Canada was a democratic was interested in democracy. So why does Sharon get to hog all of the good speaking times, right? Why does she get to be at the booth all day practicing her skills on how to talk to people about proportional representation? I think that you got to rise up and you should go and sign up for some of these slots, like 1 or 2 slots a summer. And that is really, really good practice on learning how to talk about this stuff with people who are not very familiar with it. So I encourage you, not armed resistance, but at least resistance, to go and take this away from Sharon. You should keep up the pressure. So we have MPs. We can go to our MPs. Our MPs promised that this electoral reform, let's go to them. And again, Fair Vote Canada or Lead Now might be involved with organizing some of these things. If you want the hierarchy, going to them in person is more effective than sending them snail mail. Which is more effective than sending them email, which is more effective than signing petitions. So the closer you can get to actually visiting them, and the closer that we can get so that it's not the same 5 people visiting them every 2 months, but a broad base of people visiting them and telling them that you care about this, that's going to make a difference, at least locally. Maybe it's not going to influence the national agenda, but at least our MPs will know that we care. Now, are there any signs of hope after all of these negative things? Yes. I think more people know about the term first past the post. It's in the media. People are talking about it. It's really exciting that in the Conservative Party platform, they were talking about electoral reform. That means they think people know about it. Now, they might oppose it, but they know about it. There are some big players. Fair Vote Canada has kind of been a shoestring operation. Lead Now knows how to do things. The kids are all right. So what do I mean by that? We had this spate of referendums back in the early 2000s. The kids couldn't vote then. Many of the kids, by which I mean like people under 25, people under 20, well, they support proportional representation more than they don't. And they're going to start to vote, and they will say, hey, I know there was a referendum, but I didn't get to vote into it, so I want to have a choice. So I think we can exploit this. And as I said, the Conservatives have mentioned electoral reform. So that's a good sign. So that is the end, almost. Martin, where's Martin? Do you have? So Martin is going to go around. One thing I like to do when I'm giving talks is, so it's been very one-sided. I don't know who's completely lost and bored and who is engaged. I have some feedback slips and some golf pencils, which I hope will come back. There's a two-sided feedback slip form. If while we're doing the discussion and the Q&A, you'd be willing to do some feedback and then put it on that table, that would be good. Robert. I haven't started the QA yet. You can't say something yet, but soon. And then you will keep it concise, right? No sermonizing. Were you here at the beginning of the talk? No sermonizing. Okay, so I just want to give some thanks. All of you came out, so that made it worth it. To people who offered publicity help, there were lots. People at Fairville Canada, WPERG, Darcy, Stephen, lots of people. Alexandra. Everybody who put up with me obsessing about this talk for a month and a half because I bored everybody to death. You thought this was bad? Holy cow. Everybody who helped up with setup and takedown, and the Working Center helped host this space, and also I think got us coffee, so that was very nice. Okay, now time for questions. So who is the we? Okay, so let me repeat it into the mic. So Robert wants a world democratic voting system, organization to talk about this, a democratic network. So in Canada, we have such a democratic network. And then what we have to do is attract people to that democratic network. One of those, well, we have multiple democratic networks. One of those networks is Fairville Canada, right? And so can we have something more inclusive? I think Fairville Canada can be more inclusive. Right now, it's just on voting. There are other organizations that do wider things, and I think that those are very helpful. Yep. Isaiah. Are there chapters of Fairville Canada on university campuses? There were attempts to make some. I don't know whether they still exist. There can be chapters. They are not obligated to be. Basically, the way that it happens is that when people get together and enough people get together to keep a chapter going, it runs. Yeah, Robert. So Raj Saini has plans to knock on every door or in every poll at least once during this election, and that gives us an opportunity. So when he knocks on your door, you can talk to him about proportional representation. Is that the gist of it? And we can make sure that there's people informed enough there to talk about it. Good. So November 9th is a little bit early to go to your MPs. I don't think, and correct me if I'm wrong, it's a planning meeting to see how you go to your MPs. So anybody who's interested in eventually going to the MPs, but I don't think they're going to be going not really soon, because I agree that it's going to take time for the MPs to get established. Yep. and Raj promised him. Robert worked on Raj's campaign, so he's got the insider scoop on this. Maybe you can twist a few thumbs. Other questions? Yeah, Stephen. So that's a good point. So did you get that? So basically the idea is vote for change regardless of what that change is. That's a pretty controversial view in terms of some of these. So especially with respect to instant runoff. There's definitely people, and Sharon I think is one of them, who are very against using advocating instant runoff. But I agree with the general principle that the system is not going to be the one that we want, because everybody wants a different system. But if it's good enough past the threshold, I agree that we should support it. Sharon.
I never want to actually talk about the mechanics because you really start to get into the weeds. But what we really want is for people to understand the principle and to agree that that's the kind of change we want to move towards.
So Sharon.
Because the details are well beyond what those of us in this room can really deal with and to take action on. And that would be the job of Elections Canada. Once we've all agreed that what we want is a system that is fair and equal to everyone.
So can I comment on that comment? So the comment that I have, so Sharon's comment, for those of you who may not have heard it, is that talk more about the principles of proportional representation and fair voting, and don't focus on the mechanics because you get lost in the weeds. I totally agree. You get lost in the weeds, and it's very easy to get lost in the weeds. At the end of the day, there will be an actual voting system that's proposed that will have some mechanics. There will be lots of criticisms about those mechanics, whichever voting systems we choose. So I think I agree that when talking to new people about proportional representation, it makes a lot of sense to focus on the principles. I think it also makes sense to try and give a little bit of the mechanics, just in terms of, oh, mixed member proportional, you have these top-up seats, without getting into how those top-up seats are there. And then also to maybe dissuade people from believing some of the outright mistruths that we're going to hear. Like, for example, in 2007, we got a lot of stuff about, oh, the list members are only going to be accountable to their parties, right? With the implication being that right now under first past the post, they're not. So there's legitimate criticisms, and then there's really things that are way outside. I think that what we should do is we should make sure that we emphasize that, yes, the principles are there, and also that other countries do this and they are not crazy, right? Other working countries actually do this. Yeah. They're also just allowed to recommend, oh, we should just have mandatory voting, right? Because there's nothing saying that it has to be a change to the voting system. Well, okay, so that's a good point, and I think that I'll snark just a little bit. Okay, so they said we will make every vote count, right? And clearly, if they say that this is the last election that they're going to do under first past the post, sure, maybe they'll change it. But at least from some people, they're thinking that the actual election system they choose might be something like instant runoff voting, which will not make every vote count. And in fact, you can't make every vote count, even in the best proportional system. There will be some votes that will not count. So pretty clearly, this looks like they want to give us the impression that they're going to change the system and it's going to be a proportional system. But if you actually look at what they're promising, they're just promising this committee. And if the committee says, oh, it's okay, or it'll be too much work to change the voting system, they could do that. They're not prohibited from it because we can't force them. Based upon that promise, they won't do that. But if the committee just happens to say, oh, we don't need to change the voting system, then what? Then they'll make Justin Trudeau a liar. That would be terrible. Lying and not keeping your promises. Oh, what has this world come to, David?
One point that I would like to make that I hope that everybody is really clear on now is that instant runoff or ranked voting is just another version of first past the post. So if it's okay. If Justin Trudeau wants to go through the change to the alternative vote, we need enough people educated to be able to say, hey, wait. That's another version of first past the post. That's unacceptable. So we need to educate people preemptively so they don't try to pull that shenanigans.
Yeah, so I agree. Robert? Okay, so Robert made the comment that there is another way to make every vote count in some sense. They could restore the per vote subsidies that were taken away. Nope, it's not the same as getting power, but you could potentially keep the letter of the law there, letter of the promise. Yeah, so Robert was saying it's the only place where you can control where the tax source. How are we doing for time? It is 9. It's 8:56, but it's basically 9. Are there any other last questions or comments? Yeah, Larry. So the question is, what would happen if we implemented mandatory voting? How does that interact with this? Voting rates would go up with mandatory voting. And that's about it, right? It's kind of independent of how you elect people. You'll just have more people casting votes. But first past the post and mandatory voting is going to do much the same thing that first past the post does with optional voting. Yep. Yep. So the comment is that some people should be able to have more votes than others. Yeah. As long as you're one of them. Okay. Other things? Jen. Are the slides going to be made available? Yes, they are going to be made available. Hopefully the audio will also be made available. There's a little leaflet that has the address, my blog address on it. Martin's holding them up. If you would like a copy of the presentation or the slides, and I'll link to the videos if videos go up, then I'll just put all of that stuff there. Okay, other things? Shall we call it a night? If you would like to have other conversations, I'm going to stick around, but otherwise, thank you for your attention.